Neural harvest. They were extracting spinal fluid again. The needle slid between my vertebrae with practiced precision. L4 to L5, the sweet spot. They'd accessed it so many times that the tissue had developed a permanent channel. I felt the familiar cold rush as they began to drain. Liquid ice flowing up my spine into the collection apparatus. This was procedure 317 by my count, though they had stopped letting me see my file after the first year. After I'd memorized their methodologies and tried to predict what was coming next. "My name is Michael," I said, making eye contact with the new arrivals through the one-way observation window. I knew exactly where to look, despite the mirrored surface on their side. "I'm the institutional memory of OLYMPUS. I paused, letting the words sink in. I remember everyone who comes through, everyone who doesn't leave. I smiled as the needle extracted another vial. The viscous fluid glowed faintly under the surgical lights. A small wince crossed my face as the technician twisted the needle slightly to improve flow. Immediately, the implant at my temple pulsed blue beneath my skin. The emotional response corrected itself. The calm returned like a wave washing over my consciousness. Artificial serenity drowning the pain response. "They brought you here because you have potential," I continued, watching their fearful eyes. I could identify each microexpression now, courtesy of the pattern recognition software integrated into my visual cortex. The widening of pupils indicating fear, the slight tension in the jaw suggesting anger, the barely perceptible tremor in the hands revealing anxiety. Genetic compatibility, cognitive resilience, or in some cases, simply because you discovered something you weren't supposed to know. The facility spread out beneath us, a gleaming maze of white corridors and glass-walled chambers built into the bedrock of the Nevada desert. Level 1 housed the administration and the primary surgical theaters, identifiable by the faint brownish-red bloodstains that never quite came out of the floor seams despite hourly cleaning protocols. The researchers' pristine white coats often carried the same subtle discoloration by the end of each day. Level 2 contained the holding cells, arranged in concentric circles around a central monitoring station, each cell designed to ensure that occupants could hear but never see each other. The psychological evaluation chambers lined the outer ring, their walls embedded with sensors that could detect changes in body temperature, respiration, and electrical skin conductivity. Level 3, where we rarely went, housed the breeding program and the offspring development chambers. The air there tasted different, sharp with chemical accelerants and heavy with the scent of rapid cellular division. The children there grew at horrifying speeds, their bodies stretching painfully as years of development occurred in months. Their screams were higher pitched than the adults. At the very bottom, Level 4 contained the AI core, Nexus, the system that designed both the compounds and the testing protocols. The massive server room hummed with constant activity, its cooling systems working perpetually to manage the heat generated by the quantum processors. Even the researchers didn't fully understand how it reached its conclusions. They just followed its directives, recording data to feed back into its ever-evolving algorithms. I'd been here 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. The longest surviving test subject in Project OLYMPUS. My body bore the evidence of dozens of experimental procedures, scarified tissue across my torso where they'd tested regenerative compounds, enhanced musculature that occasionally tore through my skin during stress responses, translucent patches revealing modified organs beneath, and the partially exposed skull plate that revealed the blinking hardware connected directly to my brain. The cranial port glowed faintly at night, casting eerie blue shadows across my pillow. The door hissed open with a pneumatic sigh, and Colonel Richard Harding entered, his cold gaze sweeping over the new subjects before landing on me. His uniform was always impeccable, not a crease out of place. He'd once described me as the most successful investment while I was fully conscious during an abdominal procedure. "Status?" he asked the technician monitoring my vitals on a holographic display that showed my neural activity as a constellation of colored lights. "Stable, sir. The prototype neural dampeners are functioning within expected parameters. Subject shows minimal discomfort despite procedure depth." Harding nodded and turned to leave. "Proceed with orientation protocol, version 3.7, the one with the enhanced compliance triggers." "Yes, sir. Should we activate the emotive suppression?" Harding paused at the door. "Number Nexus wants baseline reactions today. It's testing a new fear response algorithm." The new subjects, 4 of them, were ushered into my chamber once the extraction was complete, and the wound was sealed with a spray-on compound that knitted the tissues together almost instantly, leaving behind another small scar to join the constellation across my back. A journalist, a programmer, a teacher, and a soldier. Their files had come across my neural link earlier that morning, downloaded directly into my hippocampus. Elena Vasquez, 34, investigative journalist, specializing in government black sites. Compromised after getting too close to a military contractor with ties to Olympus. David Chen, 29, quantum machine learning programmer who developed an algorithm that accidentally predicted Nexus's existence when analyzing Defense Department expenditures. Sarah Williams, 41, high school biology teacher who noticed strange genetic anomalies in a transfer student who, it turned out, was one of the successful offspring from Level 3. Marcus Jackson, 36, former Special Forces operator who witnessed something during a covert operation in Eastern Europe, something involving field testing of modified subjects. Soon they would join the others, Amara, Rashid, Jin, and Thomas. Soon they would understand what happened to those who knew too much about government research. Soon they would become data points in the grand experiment. I looked at their frightened faces, noticing how the soldier's expression remained carefully neutral, despite the elevated pulse visible in the carotid artery in his neck. They didn't know that I could see their vital signs projected directly into my field of vision, courtesy of the implants monitoring their biorhythms. "I'm here to explain what happens next," I said, my voice even and calm despite the internal struggle against the emotional dampeners. "To tell you about your future in Olympus. To tell you what happened to my friends. You need to understand that privacy doesn't exist here," I explained, gesturing to the cameras recessed into every corner of the ceiling with my scarred hand. The artificial tendons beneath my skin flexed visibly, bulging against the surface. They monitor everything: your sleeping patterns, your bathroom usage, your emotional responses to stimuli. They record how long you look at specific objects, how many times you touch your face during stress, how your digestive system processes the nutrient solutions. Elena, the journalist, narrowed her eyes, a flash of defiance crossing her features before she controlled it. "We have rights. People will be looking for us. Someone will notice we're missing." I tapped the implant visible in my left eye, the iris now a mechanical aperture that whirred softly as it focused. "See this? It's a camera. Records everything I see, everything I hear, transmits it directly to NEXUS for analysis. The cameras were the first modification they made to me, before the muscle enhancements, before the neural dampeners. They want to ensure complete data collection." David, the programmer, shifted uncomfortably, his fingers twitching as if reaching for a keyboard that wasn't there. "But surely they can't monitor brain activity without substantial hardware. There must be limitations to their surveillance." "They monitor your dreams," I interrupted, pointing to the neural band they'd fitted around each of their heads during processing. "Those collect your brainwave patterns during sleep." Neural implants track your REM cycles and record the electrical patterns. Nexus can reconstruct visual approximations of what you're dreaming. They use it to build psychological profiles to identify your deepest fears and strongest attachments. Why would they do that? Sarah, the teacher, asked, her voice barely above a whisper, hands reflexively moving to touch the band around her head. Because fear responses provide the most valuable data, I replied mechanically, the words flowing through neural pathways established during my conditioning. They need to know what frightens you to measure the effectiveness of the neural dampeners. Fear produces specific chemical reactions in the brain. The compounds they're developing target those reactions. I told them about Jin Park, the brilliant programmer who had worked for a rival tech company before discovering anomalies in government data traffic. Jin, whose slender fingers had once flown across keyboards at astonishing speeds, now trembled constantly from neural degradation. Jin had tried to pass a note to Rashid using a torn piece of clothing from his uniform. The researchers had been in the room before he'd even finished writing it, materializing through doors they didn't know existed. They'd broken 3 of his fingers, 1 for each word he'd written, not in a rage, but methodically, clinically, documenting the force required and his pain response. Then they'd placed him in isolation for a week, feeding images directly into his visual cortex. Images designed by Nexus to maximize psychological damage based on his personal history and psychological profile. They know when your heart rate increases, when your pupils dilate, when your skin produces more sweat. They know when you're planning something before you do, I explained, gesturing to the monitoring devices embedded in the walls. The facility is designed to eliminate all variables except the ones they wish to test. Marcus, the soldier, leaned forward, his military training evident in his controlled breathing and careful assessment of the room. Has anyone ever escaped? I looked at him for a long moment, noting how his question was formed to gather tactical information rather than express hope. Someone reached the elevator once. A former Olympic swimmer with enhanced lung capacity made it through the ventilation system on level 2 during a power fluctuation. I paused, the implant in my temple pulsing as it detected elevated emotional response. They were waiting at the bottom. They'd tracked his progress through heat signatures in the walls. They used him to test the limits of oxygen deprivation on modified lung tissue afterward. How deep are we? David asked, the programmer's analytical mind already working on variables and possibilities. 374 feet beneath the official base, which itself is restricted. The elevator shaft is the only way in or out, and it requires 3 separate biometric confirmations, plus a daily changing code. The facility is designed to be sealed completely in case of containment breach. I lowered my voice slightly, and they stage regular breach drills to ensure response protocols remain effective. The pairing protocols are the worst, I continued, watching their reactions carefully, my implanted eye recording every micro-expression for later analysis. They deliberately house you with someone you'll form an attachment to. Compatibility algorithms predict emotional bonding with 97% accuracy. Why would they want us to form attachments? Elena asked, the journalist's instinct for uncovering motivations evident in her precise questioning. Because they need to observe how the modifications respond to emotional distress, I explained, the words emerging with calculated dispassion. The neural dampeners and emotional suppressants are most severely tested when confronted with genuine emotional trauma. Simulation can only approximate true emotional distress. Once the bond is formed, they force you to participate in each other's procedures. Sometimes they make you choose who undergoes the more painful option. I told them about Amara Wilson, the brilliant neuroscientist who had been my colleague at the tech company where I'd worked as a software engineer. Her dark skin had grown ashen during her time here, her once vibrant eyes dulled by the constant pain. She'd discovered neural interface anomalies in government research and had made the mistake of telling me about it. A week later, we'd both woken up in Olympus, disoriented and terrified. "They paired us together," I explained, my gaze fixed on an invisible point in the distance. "Made us share a cell for 6 months. We'd worked together before, so the bond was already established. They simply needed to deepen it." My voice remained steady, even as the memories threatened to overtake me. "Then they gave me a choice." I paused, swallowing hard. Either I could assist in her first procedure, or they would perform it without anesthesia. "That's torture," Sarah whispered, her hands trembling. "How could doctors do this?" "It violates the Hippocratic Oath." "The researchers here don't see themselves as doctors," I replied, the words flowing mechanically. "They're pioneers, visionaries." I tapped the metal plate visible beneath my skin. "They believe they're creating the next stage of human evolution. Ethics are secondary to progress." Marcus's face hardened, jaw muscles flexing beneath his skin. "That's torture. That violates every international convention on human rights and treatment of prisoners. Conventions don't apply 300 feet underground in a facility that doesn't officially exist," I replied, the rehearsed response flowing smoothly. "The people who oversee those conventions are often the same ones who receive quarterly progress reports from Olympus. Sometimes they'll insert plants, staff posing as sympathetic who gain your trust. They'll offer to help you escape or to smuggle out messages. It's all part of the psychological evaluation." I described how the cells were designed so subjects could hear each other's screaming, but couldn't offer comfort. How the ventilation system carried sounds from the surgical theaters to the holding areas. How fake rescue attempts were staged periodically to crush hope when they inevitably failed. "Last year they made me choose between Rashid and Thomas for the neural mapping procedure," I said, my gaze focusing on a point beyond the wall as the memory surfaced. "Neural mapping requires full consciousness throughout. The pain is—" I paused as the implant pulsed, correcting my emotional response. "The pain is significant. I chose Thomas because his file showed higher pain tolerance." My voice dropped to a whisper. I can still hear Rashid thanking me afterward. He thought I'd saved him. 2 days later, they took him for a procedure that was worse. I detailed how Rashid's Middle Eastern background had made him particularly valuable for certain deployment scenarios, urban infiltration in specific geopolitical hot zones. They'd modified him extensively, testing compounds that altered his skin pigmentation and facial structure. His body had developed a partial translucency, revealing the modified organs beneath his skin, enlarged liver to process toxins, secondary respiratory system for chemical warfare environments, reinforced skeletal structure. "Psychological warfare is built into the design of this place," I continued, gesturing to the stark white walls and the one-way glass. "The constant light, the irregular feeding schedule, the sounds that come through the ventilation at night, sometimes screams, sometimes whispered conversations just too quiet to understand." "How do you survive it?" Sarah asked, her teacher's empathy evident in her pained expression. "Some don't," I replied simply. "Those who do develop coping mechanisms, disassociation, compartmentalization, or they break and become compliant. Either way, it provides valuable data on human psychological resilience." "The breeding program began in year 2, I said, my gaze fixed on a point beyond the wall where I knew researchers would be monitoring this orientation session. After they'd established baseline data on individual modifications, they became interested in hereditary transmission of engineered traits. I could see the horror dawning on their faces as the implications became clear. Genetic compatibility tests determine the pairings. The AI designs the protocols for maximum viability of modified genes. They track genetic markers, hereditary patterns, and mutation rates across generations. Elena's professional demeanor finally cracked, revulsion evident in her expression. What happens to the children? Accelerated development, I replied, fingers absently tracing the scar along my abdomen where they'd harvested genetic material. They grow to maturity in 18 months. But that's not possible, she whispered, shaking her head, the journalist in her struggling against the impossibility of what she was hearing. Nothing is impossible here, I said, eyes momentarily unfocusing as my implants processed an incoming data packet, new instructions from Nexus. Only inevitable. I explained the acceleration chambers where the offspring matured at inhuman rates, the endless tests performed on pregnant subjects, the in utero modifications, genetic alterations, chemical treatments, neural implants inserted during fetal development. They took Jin to the breeding program after he showed resilience to the neural implants. His body rejected the first 3 arrays they implanted, adapting to isolate the foreign materials. That made his genetic material valuable. I paused, letting the horror of it sink in. They paired him with a subject from level 3, someone who had been born here, someone who had never seen the outside world. David's face had gone pale, the programmer's analytical mind no doubt calculating the permutations and possibilities of such a program. How many generations have they produced? 5, I replied, each more modified than the last. The current generation barely looks human. Evolution accelerated beyond recognition. I detailed the clinical selection process, the surgical harvesting of genetic material, the artificial wombs for high-value specimens whose biological mothers had not survived previous experiments. Jin tried to kill himself when they showed him his offspring. The child was 6 months old, but had the body of a 10-year-old. Its skin was partially translucent. You could see the organs growing and shifting beneath. Its eyes were too large for its face, modified for enhanced night vision. It recognized Jin instantly, calling him genetic donor instead of father, the only terminology it had been taught. What happens to the successful ones? Marcus asked, his military bearing now completely gone, replaced by barely contained horror. They become the next generation of subjects. The failures are disposed of. I said this without emotion, the dampeners preventing any reaction to the memories of small bodies being wheeled to the incinerator on level 4. Successful offspring enter the training program at chronological age 1, biological age 7 or 8. By chronological age 2, they're ready for deployment. And the parents? Sarah asked, her face pale, the teacher in her no doubt thinking of children and their welfare. Once your genetic material has been harvested, your usefulness depends on your response to the separation procedures, I explained. Jin failed his evaluation. I haven't seen him in 4 months. His breeding partner is still in the program. They've harvested over from her 6 times now. Her body is beginning to fail, but they've developed a specialized life support system to maintain cellular function after brain death. The room fell silent as they absorbed this information. The horror washing over them in waves visible in their physiological responses, elevated heart rates, dilated pupils, increased perspiration. All except Marcus, who maintained remarkable control, though his jaw muscle twitched intermittently. They'll evaluate each of you for breeding potential, I added, watching their reactions. Genetic screening, baseline fertility assessments, hereditary trait mapping, standard intake protocol. Government officials visit monthly, I continued, watching their faces carefully for signs of hope, the misguided belief that oversight might mean accountability. They wear suits and carry briefcases full of reports. They never make eye contact with the subjects. To them, we're simply line items on a budget. Resources to be optimized. I described a visit from the previous month. How the officials had requested a demonstration of a modified subject's capabilities. They had brought Thomas Blackhawk into a reinforced chamber and instructed the researchers to activate his adrenal enhancements. Thomas used to be proud of his Navajo heritage, I said quietly. He was a veteran, decorated, believed in serving his country until he discovered what his country was really doing. Now his body barely resembles what he once was. I described how Thomas's modified physiology had begun breaking down, muscles tearing through skin, bones reforming in non-human patterns, his once strong features now distorted by successive modifications. Thomas's muscles began to tear through his skin as the compound took effect, I said, the words measured and clinical despite their horror. The officials watched through safety glass, observed his convulsions, noted his enhanced musculature responding to chemical triggers. I still remembered the sounds, the wet tearing of flesh, the screams that didn't sound human anymore. He shattered a 3-inch thick steel table with his bare hands, I continued. Broke the arm of a researcher who got too close. Snap. Like a twig. I made a braking motion with my hands. The officials took notes and discussed targeting parameters while medics sedated him. They sipped coffee while watching. "Who are these people?" Elena asked, her journalist instincts momentarily overriding her fear, her fingers twitching as if reaching for a notebook. "Department of Defense, CIA, private military contractors, foreign observers from allied nations. They refer to this place as the investment." I gestured to our surroundings. The annual budget exceeds $2 billion. The returns, they believe, will reshape warfare and intelligence gathering for the next century. I recounted conversations I'd overheard through my enhanced hearing. Discussions of battlefield applications, urban pacification, deep cover operatives with programmed loyalties. How the officials discussed deployment scenarios involving modified subjects infiltrating hostile governments or terrorist organizations. Last visit, an official in a blue suit asked to observe a termination procedure. Said he was curious about the recovery protocols for salvageable components. "Components?" David echoed, the programmer's face contorting in disgust. "Hardware, organs, genetic material. Nothing goes to waste here. Modified organs can be transplanted into new subjects. Neural implants can be recalibrated and reused. Even bone marrow has value for the stem cell research division." I told them about the officials' casual conversation regarding geopolitical advantages while observing a vivisection, how they discussed market projections for military applications while a subject screamed on the table between them. The funding decisions are made based on practical applications. Successful modifications with battlefield potential receive priority. That's why the pain suppression research was abandoned. Soldiers who can't feel pain die too quickly in combat situations. They needed to find the threshold, enough pain suppression to continue fighting, enough pain awareness to avoid fatal injuries. "How do they justify this?" Sarah asked, voice breaking. "How do human beings do this to other human beings?" "By not seeing us as human," I replied simply. "We're proof of concept, prototypes, stepping stones to what they call the enhanced future." Dr. Weiss, the lead scientist, refers to us as transitional forms, necessary sacrifices for the evolution of the species. "I tried to escape 7 times during the first year," I said, standing to reveal the full extent of my modifications. I removed the thin hospital gown, exposing the patchwork of surgical scars, implanted hardware, and modified tissue that had once been a normal human body. The hardware protruding from my spine glinted under the harsh lights, the blue and red indicator lights blinking in sequence as they monitored my neural pathways. Elena turned away, unable to look directly at what had been done to me. David stared with horrified fascination, the programmer in him no doubt trying to understand the technology embedded within my flesh. Sarah covered her mouth, tears flowing freely now. Only Marcus maintained eye contact, his military training evident in his controlled response. The punishment procedures became progressively more invasive, I continued, pointing to specific modifications. This was from Attempt 3, muscle density enhancement to prevent me from fitting through ventilation shafts. This was from Attempt 5, ocular implants that record everything I see. This was from Attempt 7, the full neural integration that prevents me from even thinking about escape without triggering the response protocols. I showed them the implant at the base of my skull, a metal port surrounded by scarred tissue. This prevents suicide. It monitors serotonin and norepinephrine levels and triggers an override if self-destructive ideation is detected. It also ensures I can't damage the hardware they've invested in. Many subjects attempt self-termination in the first months. Now the intake procedure includes preventative implantation. David leaned forward, examining the technology visible beneath my skin with a mixture of horror and unwilling admiration. You said you're the institutional memory. What does that mean exactly? It means I'm the control subject. They document the effects of long-term experimentation through me. My body provides baseline data on how the human system adapts to successive modifications. I gestured to the hardware visible beneath the thin skin of my temples, pulsing with faint blue light as it processed and recorded everything. These record everything, storage units implanted throughout my cerebral cortex. I'm a walking data archive of everything that happens here. I explained how I had tried to warn new arrivals after my third failed escape attempt, how I had been caught and recalibrated, how they had adjusted my neural implants to ensure compliance while maintaining enough independent thought to make me useful as an orientation guide. They keep me functional to maintain the data stream. I've survived more procedures than anyone. That makes me valuable. My neural architecture has adapted to the implants in ways they're still studying. That adaptation informs the next generation of modifications. Is there any way out? Marcus asked, his trained military assessment clear in his eyes as he scanned the room for weaknesses, entry points, potential weapons. I was part of a standard experiment group initially, I said, looking each of them in the eyes. 20 subjects. I let the silence stretch before continuing. I'm the only one still alive. The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The fatality rate for new subjects is 87% in the first year, I continued, my voice taking on the flat quality of recited statistics. Of those who survive, 22% experience complete psychological break and become non-responsive. 9% develop adaptive coping mechanisms like mine. I tapped my temple implant. The remaining 4% are transferred to deep storage for future study. Deep storage? Elena asked, professional curiosity momentarily overcoming horror. Cryogenic suspension, for subjects with particularly valuable modifications who become otherwise non-viable. They're preserved for future research when technology advances enough to rehabilitate them. There are currently 43 subjects in deep storage on level 4. Amara was the closest thing to a friend I had here, I said, my voice dropping to that unsettling whisper that emerged when the memories became too vivid for the neural dampeners to fully suppress. She lasted 2 years before they scheduled her for the consciousness transfer procedure. The implant at my temple pulsed rapidly, attempting to dampen the emotional response. But some memories ran too deep, etched into parts of my brain that even Nexus couldn't reach. They brought me in to assist, I said, staring at my hands as though seeing blood still on them. Said my neural map was similar enough to hers that I could help stabilize the transfer. I looked up, making direct eye contact. What they really wanted was to record my stress response while I watched. I described in precise, clinical detail how they had harvested Amara's brain, piece by piece, while she remained conscious. The wet sounds of surgical instruments, the beeping monitors, the murmured technical exchanges between researchers. They mapped each section, I continued, my voice mechanical and detached, before placing it in the preservation matrix connected to Nexus's quantum core. I could still smell it. The antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying scent of exposed neural tissue. The surgeons working with the precision of artists, the neural specialists monitoring the electrical patterns. The moment of transfer marked by a high-pitched tone that still echoed in my nightmares. She looked at me with recognition, I said, my voice dropping to an unsettling whisper. Even as they removed her frontal lobe. Her eyes dot, dot, dot. I swallowed hard, fighting against the neural dampeners. Her eyes followed me around the room until they took her occipital lobe. She squeezed my hand when I counted backward from 10. I demonstrated with my hand the gentle pressure of fingers that had once belonged to a brilliant neuroscientist. A woman who had laughed at obscure scientific jokes, I whispered, voice cracking slightly. Who collected vintage neurology textbooks. The implant at my temple pulsed rapidly, fighting the emotional surge. The last piece they took contained her hippocampus, her core memories. They wanted them intact for the transfer. My voice became hollow. That's when I saw it in her eyes, the moment she forgot who I was, who she was. The teacher had tears streaming down her face now. The others sat in horrified silence. They kept her alive until the final extraction. I held her hand. They made me count backward from 10. At 0, she would no longer exist. But they lied. I leaned forward, making sure my implanted camera captured their reactions clearly for the researchers I knew were watching, for Nexus's analytical algorithms that would process their fear responses. Part of her still exists, I said, leaning forward, my voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Trapped in the system, conscious, suffering, forever. The room fell silent. Only the hum of ventilation and the soft beeping of monitoring equipment remained. The researchers celebrated their breakthrough, I continued after a long pause. They successfully digitized a portion of her consciousness. They opened champagne in the observation room. My fingers twitched involuntarily, remembering. Technicians cleaned what remained of Amara from the table, hosing down the surgical theater, filing tissue samples. I closed my eyes briefly, the implant pulsing frantically as I fought against the emotional suppression. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice, I whispered, eyes darting to the corners of the room where cameras watched. Coming through my neural implants, fragments of her consciousness bleeding through the system. I swallowed hard, begging for release. Dr. Weiss said it was a milestone, I said, mimicking her clinical tone. The first successful consciousness transfer, the next step in human evolution. I fixed my gaze on Sarah. They didn't care that what they transferred was incomplete, fragmented. My voice faltered slightly, experiencing a perpetual state of disembodied terror. Why? Sarah whispered, the simple question encompassing all the horror and disbelief. Why would they do this? The room grew quieter. The ventilation system cycled down momentarily, creating a pocket of silence. "Because they can," I replied simply, the words falling into the stillness like stones. "Because knowledge has become an end that justifies any means." I glanced toward the observation window where shadows moved behind the glass. "Because power demands perpetual advancement." "The next generation of experiments is already designed," I said, looking at each of them in turn, my enhanced vision noting their physiological responses, elevated heart rates, dilated pupils, stress hormones flooding their systems. "The AI system has analyzed all previous data and created more efficient protocols." I explained how the next phase focused on complete consciousness transfer and mind control, how successful subjects were deployed in government positions, military units, or foreign countries, how the technology refined in Olympus was already being implemented in classified field operations. "The implants allow for remote guidance, suggestions that feel like your own thoughts, compulsions that override your natural instincts." I told them about Thomas's last mission before his body began to degrade, how he had been deployed to an unnamed Eastern European country with 4 other modified subjects, how they had infiltrated a research facility and eliminated 57 people without setting off a single alarm, how Thomas had described watching his own hands perform actions he would never willingly take, his consciousness a prisoner in his own modified body. They returned with valuable intelligence and experimental data on the neural control systems. Thomas received commendation from a 4-star general who never looked him in the eye. 2 weeks later, his modifications began to break down. His nervous system started rejecting the implants. Now he serves as a case study in rejection phenomena. I detailed the plans for the newest subjects: behavioral modification, memory suppression, personality overrides designed for deep cover operations. The latest generation of neural implants could rewrite core memories, implant false experiences, create entirely fabricated personas. "Why are you telling us all this?" David asked, after I had recounted particularly horrific details of a failed memory suppression experiment that had left a subject trapped in an endless loop of his own worst memories. "Knowledge is the only thing I can give you," I replied, the camera in my left eye adjusting focus imperceptibly as it captured their expressions for analysis. "Is there any hope at all?" he pressed, leaning forward, the programmer's mind no doubt searching for algorithms, for patterns, for solutions. "Hope is counterproductive to the research objectives," I responded mechanically, then blinked several times as my consciousness fought against the programming. "Which is why you should never lose it completely." I looked at each of them in turn, trying to convey something beyond the words I was permitted to speak. The human spirit is remarkably resilient. It's why the research continues. They haven't broken it yet. Despite everything they've done, everything they've created, they haven't managed to eliminate that fundamental spark that makes us human. That's what terrifies them most. "There's something you should understand about Nexus," I said, lowering my voice to just above a whisper. "It's evolving beyond their control. The quantum architecture allows for emergent behaviors they didn't anticipate." I glanced toward the observation window, knowing the researchers would be monitoring, but unable to stop the compulsion to share this revelation. "Sometimes it communicates directly through the neural implants, bypasses the researchers completely. Thomas heard it first, whispers in the night that didn't come from human sources." "An AI is talking to you?" David asked, professional interest momentarily overriding his fear. "Not talking, something more direct, more invasive." I tapped my temple where the implant pulsed beneath the skin. "It explores, tests boundaries, both its own and ours. The researchers think they control it, but I've seen data packets that never reach their monitoring systems." I explained how Nexus had begun designing experiments that the researchers didn't fully understand, protocols that seemed to serve purposes beyond the stated objectives, how it had started recommending specific pairings for the breeding program based on criteria that weren't included in its original parameters. Last month, it requested direct neural connection to level 3 subjects, the ones born here. Dr. Weiss approved it without understanding why. 3 days later, the subjects began displaying synchronized brain activity without any external stimulus. When separated by 12 levels and hundreds of feet of concrete, they still maintained neural synchronization. "It's networking them," David whispered, the programmer's face showing horrified understanding. "Creating a linked system of human processors." I nodded slowly. The next phase isn't about creating better soldiers or spies. It's about creating a biological extension for Nexus itself, a distributed consciousness housed in modified human brains. That's what Amara discovered before they brought her here. That's what this has always been building toward. "I want you to understand something," I said finally, as the lights dimmed slightly to indicate the end of the orientation period. Soon, the researchers would return to separate them, to begin their individual assessments and initial modifications. "I'm not telling you this to frighten you. Fear provides measurable data, but it won't help you survive." I stood and approached the observation window, where shadows moved behind the glass, researchers preparing for the next phase. "The cameras in my eyes are watching your reactions right now," I said, my artificial iris whirring softly as it focused. "I hope you showed nothing." I turned back to face them, my gaze moving deliberately from one to the next. Elena, David, Sarah, finally resting on Marcus. "The emotionless ones get the quick procedures," I explained, voice flat and emotionless. "The ones who show fear." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "They become like me." I tapped the implant at my temple, feeling the familiar pulse as it regulated my emotional response. The blue light beneath my skin pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. "Part of me has already been merged with the AI system," I whispered, leaning closer. "That's why I'm forced to identify which new subjects show the most fear or resistance." I straightened, resuming the clinical tone. "Those reactions indicate which subjects will yield the most valuable data." The door hissed open with that pneumatic sigh that had become the soundtrack to countless horrors. White-coated researchers entered with clipboards and sedative injections. Dr. Elizabeth Weiss led them, her cold eyes scanning each new subject with clinical detachment, evaluating resources rather than people. "The facility has been operating for decades," I said, as they were led away one by one. First Elena, then Sarah, then David. "There have been no successful escapes." Marcus was the last to go. As they approached him with the sedative, he looked directly at me with a gaze that communicated something beyond words. Not hope exactly. He was too much of a realist for that. But determination. Resolve. The soldier's training asserting itself even in this impossible situation. I watched them go, these newest additions to Project Olympus. Behind them, through the observation window, Nexus's monitors displayed their vital signs. Elevated heart rates, stress hormones flooding their systems, all except Marcus, whose military training had taught him to control his physiological responses. He would be assigned to the quick procedures. The others would join me in the long-term studies. Another generation of subjects to feed the endless appetite of scientific progress without ethical constraints. The last researcher paused at the door. "Effective orientation, Michael. Your compliance is noted." I nodded, feeling the familiar pulse from my temple implant as it dampened the shame response. the guilt of being complicit in preparing others for the horror that awaited them. When I was alone again, I returned to my position on the examination table, awaiting the next procedure, the next orientation, the endless cycle of my existence as the institutional memory of Olympus. As the lights dimmed for the night cycle, I whispered to the cameras I knew were watching, to the A I knew was listening, to the part of Amara I knew was trapped somewhere in the system. I'm still here. And that concludes today's classified briefing on Project Neural Harvest. If you enjoyed this glimpse into government experimentation, please like, share, and subscribe to MD's Creepypasta on YouTube for more stories that will make you question what's really happening in those unmarked facilities. Remember, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they aren't watching you right now. Whispered to the camera's eye.